Okay, that's quite the way to start the day. Uh, Cracked your head and poured state government into it. That is interesting. Right. Oh, that's fair. That's fair. Yes, the very beginnings. There's a lot going on in all the ways. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the end of week 5. We are officially into the thick of it. It has been quite a year thus far, and while things are as stable as they've felt in a long time here in Maryland, in terms of our leadership and coordination, certainly the impacts of the federal level are more intense than I think any of us ever could have expected. On Monday, we had our first, or the bill introduction date. We had about 117 less bills in the Senate introduced than we had from the prior year at the same time. So we've had a lot of conversations about the bill limits and the impact on what would happen for the Senate's productivity. And what we've seen is that it has played out as we had hoped, and that we have a little bit more time. Now, the EEE committee, who we have the chair and vice chair here today, they have a little bit of the overburden, a lot of education bills, a lot of energy bills, and so the EEE committee is going to be doing some heavy lifting. But for the most part, overall, we're going to have a little bit more time to focus in on the complex issues. We've already sent about 16 bills over to the House, so the Senate is moving efficiently through the year. And I have a number of 3 senators here today that will help highlight some of the bills that I think really deserve some attention. We've talked about the budget and energy being the leading topics and the things that we have to absolutely tackle this year. But of course, we walk and chew gum at the same time, and so we also have to take up some other important issues, and we want to highlight some of those today. I know there will likely be some more questions about the energy package. We've seen some of our Republican friends offer some thoughts that are seemingly convenient these days. But I really believe in the package that our leadership team with the House has put together. It really provides an additional way for Maryland to have additional Maryland-made energy. It's going to be cleaner than the energy we produce today, and hopefully it happens faster than it would have without this legislative package. I do want to highlight some of the other complexities. We just recently learned that the Peach Bottom transmission line, which is one that has not gotten a lot of attention thus far, that estimates for its construction came back from what were around $500 to $600 million to $1.5 billion, nearly doubling the cost for a single transmission line. This is the one that was planned, anticipated to bring nuclear energy from Pennsylvania into Maryland, but what we know is that a new natural gas plant would cost about $1.2 billion, and instead we're getting a transmission line at $1.5 billion that gets put into rates and that we have to pay off for the next 30 years. Frankly, it's unacceptable to see a cost increase at this level. Something has to be reviewed and assessed because this doesn't make any sense. And so we're going to have to anticipate this moving forward in our plans to make sure that we are protecting ratepayers and Marylanders from increased costs. Last thing I just want to highlight before I hand it over is what's happening at the federal level. And I wish I had good news to share. Unfortunately, I don't. We had a conversation this morning with Senator Van Hollen, who addressed the Baltimore City delegation meeting today, and talked about the plans that the Republican leadership in Congress is anticipating to release today, and their efforts to pursue tax cuts for billionaires on the backs of shifting costs to the states for Medicaid assessments. We know that Medicaid has been a driver of some of our challenges in the state. Additional cuts to Medicaid or additional cost shifts will have an absolutely devastating impact on the state of Maryland. And so when we look at the challenges that we've been facing at the beginning of session, we said we have to see what the actual data shows. The reality is it's worse than we expected. And what's coming down from the federal government, each civil servant position that is lost accounts for roughly 3 to 5 private sector consultant contracting-based jobs that are largely or a large part of Maryland's employment base. This is going to have an enormously negative impact on Maryland's economy and our ability to invest in our priorities. And I say all of this because I think we are going to have a very sobering conversation about what this budget looks like in the next 30 days. And even if we did all of the revenues that are already being anticipated, of which we likely will not do all of them in the adjustments, we're still going to likely have to find an additional several $100 million of additional cuts and savings within state government. And this is largely because of what we're seeing from the Trump administration's impact on the state government here in Maryland and the provision of services. You look at the Catholic Relief Services that is having to furlough hundreds of employees in the Baltimore area. There's another relief agency based in Bethesda that just put 400 employees on furlough. That is an impact for those families that is absolutely devastating. It's an impact to the global society that is devastating. And it's an impact to Maryland state budget because of simply the revenues that will no longer be there because of those who have been terminated without clear cause or reason. With that, I just know that the next 60 days are going to be tough. We've gotten through the first third. We knew we would have more information at this point. We're getting that information, and it's less positive than we had hoped. So we'll figure our way through it one way or the other, but it's important to start making it clear to Marylanders and agencies that there's more cuts to come. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Senator Nick Charles, who is going to highlight a bill that is important for a lot of communities that a lot of folks don't know about, with squatters who have been taking over some homes, and there has not been a process for dealing with the unauthorized occupants from staying over at the property. So with that, Senator Nick Charles.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'm happy to be here today with you all and my colleagues to talk about Senate Bill 989. It's a bill that Senator Watson and I have sponsored together. There's been a lot of bills that's come before JPR, and this year, what this bill, Senate Bill 989, is going to do is going to create an opportunity for owners and renters to protect themselves from the beginning, becoming victims in the first place. It allows local sheriffs to establish a registry that owners can list their property on, that creates a rebuttable presumption, an assumption that anyone there without permission of the owner can be safely removed from the property without having to be tied up in court. And that's been one of the major issues, trying to understand how we'll get through the court system with this. This is a digital and physical no trespassing sign before the inside of the house. Senate Bill 989 does not create a new crime because it does not need to be. Some of the people living in a home illegally themselves are victims of fraud, and that's been a big conversation in JPR over these last 2 weeks, is how do we deal with the people that are victims of the fraud themselves? Some may say they've been falsely represented with an agent of the owner, and sometimes we have to figure out how do we deal with that. So what this does is, with the registry, it allows for a renter to check ahead of time and to be sure the home isn't an actual trap. So this should help alleviate a lot of the issues within the court. So I look forward to this bill hearing, which will be on the 25th in JPR, and working with my colleagues and the Senate as a whole as we address this issue, which is a true nightmare, not only for the homeowners themselves, but for the renters alike. And so now I'd like to turn it over to the Vice Chair of the Committee on Education, Energy and Environment, Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Senator Charles. I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the Senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville and the Vice Chair of what I sometimes call EQUAD, Energy, Education, Energy, and the Environment, and Elections. And that is going to be keeping us busy, especially in these crazy times at the federal level when the Trump administration has raised doubts about the sanctity of our elections. It's really important that we make sure that Maryland's elections, which are already great, continue to be improved. I've sponsored 11 bills, including bills to improve transparency, make sure that voters know what they're voting on with simplified ballot language when they're coming to vote on a ballot measure, and making sure that our legislators are more likely to be elected than selected by our party central committees. Several of these have passed the Senate. We are hoping that they will move forward in the House, and there are continuing to be a lot of other issues. I'm happy to take any questions about this, but bottom line is Maryland does a great job with our elections at the state level, as well as in our 24 county jurisdictions, but there's always room for improvement. Thank you. I'm delighted to pass it on to my chair and my friend, Brian Feldman, the chair of EEE.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. Let me just, I think it's important, I always like to outline, although the title, the broad jurisdiction of the committee, okay? So it's, we've got the titles of education, energy, and environment, but in fact, the jurisdiction extends, I gotta go to roll it out, cybersecurity, data centers, affordable housing, natural resources, and election law. more bills than any, for that reason, more bills than any other committee in the General Assembly. We're sitting right now with 342 Senate bills in the committee. We're off to a good, strong start, building on a very strong 2024 session where a lot of the heavy lifting bills, if you go back, came out of the EEE committee. I think the Senate President made the point after the budget. I think this session largely will revolve, I think the hottest issue is energy policy. And so we started with briefings from the Public Service Commission, Maryland Energy Administration. We have new reports from the PJM grid operator on some things, updated modeling relating to the urgency of us acting to address our resource adequacy issues this session. Earlier this week with the Senate President and Speaker and C.T. Wilson and others, many of you attended the press conference where we rolled out a leadership package of 3 bills. But I want to say there are numerous other energy bills other senators have brought in, and we're actually going to have hearings on some of those as early as this week. Let me just also, on the energy stuff, I actually happen to chair a national task force on energy policy and energy supply at NCSL. And I do think it's important so I have a national perspective, and the issues that we're facing here in Maryland are not unique to Maryland. A lot of these are issues that are being confronted and faced by states all over the nation in different ways. On education, we have jurisdiction both K through 12 and higher ed, and so we got briefings from the Accountability Implementation Board, the State Department of Education, the superintendents came to the committee. The governor does have legislation proposing several adjustments to the blueprint, Senate Bill 429, the Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act. We're going to do a joint hearing with the Budget and Tax Committee on February 19th, and it has a lot of provisions. We also, on higher ed, got a briefing from the chancellor and the University System of Maryland about the impact of potential cuts. On the environmental front, I want to commend the Senate President for putting energy and environment in the same committee. It wasn't always that way. You can't really decouple those issues anymore. In the House of Delegates, it's 2 separate committees, economic matters, environment. I think it makes tremendous sense in it. And so on that front, we have some issues dealing with the building energy performance standards that are a bit of an outgrowth of the Climate Solutions Act. So there's some litigation out there. In any event, there could be some modifications to that. The issue of electric vehicles, we had a briefing with the Environment and Transportation Committee a couple of weeks ago, and that is a complicated issue. So right now, President Trump has asked, so we have adopted the California Advanced Cars 2 model here in Maryland, and taking advantage of an option available to states to use the California model or federal law. Anyway, the Trump administration has asked its EPA, its newly minted EPA Director Zeldin, former congressman, to get rid of the California waiver. And there is some sense that within the next couple of weeks, he may agree to that. There's some legal issues about whether they can do that, but the bottom line is, if that happens, that will have major impacts on our electric vehicle deployment and the model and the percentages and all the like. If that doesn't happen, there could be some modifications there. On Chesapeake Bay, we had a good briefing on bay restoration. The governor does have a piece of legislation, the Chesapeake Bay Legacy Act, Senate Bill 428, that's going to be heard on February 11th. Does a lot of things on bay. A topic a lot of folks don't know that we even have jurisdiction over is affordable housing. Last session, we tried to tackle, the governor did with package, but to deal with our 100,000 unit housing shortage. Last year's bill dealt with some incentives for new affordable housing in exchange for increasing density for our developers. This year, the governor does have another bill, Senate Bill 430, the Housing for Jobs Act. And the goal of that bill, like the bill last year, is spur the production of more housing, bring the cost of housing down. It's basically to match where are the jobs in our state, where is the housing, and if there's a gap, try to close that gap. So that's the goal of that bill. And that will be heard soon. And as Senator Kagan mentioned, election law, filling legislative vacancies. So I'll stop there, but we have a lot on our plate, a lot of broad jurisdiction, and we're going to be super busy. So with that, I'll yield back to the Senate President.
Questions?
Mr. President, you mentioned the tax and revenues issue. You said hundreds of millions. What do you think the number is right now where we stand today? What's that number going to look like, and what's the mix that you think you're gonna have, that the legislature's gonna have to come in with in terms of additional revenues versus additional cuts?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to really look at deeply at cuts. I think there are a lot of agencies and entities out there that, the governor did a great job trying to balance everything. As we're starting to get some of these projections of what could be coming down the pike, be it with shifts in costs from Medicaid, with the impact of terminations of federal employees, and then therefore the termination of related contractors that are associated with those civil servant jobs, it's looking a lot deeper. And so, there's only so much that we can get through any type of revenue plan, and we have to remain competitive in the region and nationally. And so I think this is going to be a rebasing year when it comes to spending.
When you said, you used the term hundreds of millions, what's the over-under here on 500 million? Are we talking about under at this point, 500 million?
I would say, right now, I would say under, but if we see a shift from the Medicaid population, the Medicaid expansion population from what is now a 50-50 state federal cost shift to a 47-53, I mean, that's at a couple $100 million above that. So we're at $1 billion and a half at that point. So, I think that as we're going through this budget process and more data is coming in, which we knew was going to be the case, as the new administration came in, we were going to have to assess along the way, and that's where we are, and it's not looking pretty.
Is that the number 4753 that you've heard?
I've heard everything from 40 to 60 to 25-75. Cut out the ACA, and so I mean, realistically, there are a lot of red states that have expanded Medicaid and have really benefited from the Affordable Care Act, and it's a reason why you're not hearing huge desires to cut the Affordable Care Act anymore. But I think as it appears, there isn't going to be an effort to do major tax cuts for billionaires. We saw who was at the inauguration and who was sitting in the front rows, and you got to pay for that somehow. And I think that what we've heard and what was certainly validated by Senator Van Hollen this morning is that one of the key targets to pay for those cuts, tax cuts for billionaires, is to adjust and cut Medicaid. And you can do it by cutting services, or you can do it by shifting the cost to the states. And I have a feeling that the effort is going to be to shift the cost to the states. We'll see more today, but and there's going to be two separate parts of these bills, but no matter what, it doesn't look pretty.
Mr. President, are there
on the
concerns?
Just to follow up on the Medicaid, thank you. To follow up on the Medicaid, obviously it's changing and we don't know exactly where they're gonna do, but what's the best estimate in terms of dollars that Maryland could be losing on Medicaid?
I wish I could give an exact answer. It just so depends on what the ultimate landing spot is. I mean, what we know right now is that we were roughly a little bit 1.1 billion over in projections. Some of it had to do with enrollment, some of it had to do with the acuity of care. There's a number of different spots where this is hit. The cost shift is really what I'm most concerned about. We have to deal with the issue of the spending above projections, no matter what. We have to. What is uncertain is what happens with the cost shift.
Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you. Are there concerns, given the uncertain climate in D.C., that the key bridge funding could be in jeopardy, even for something as trivial as changing the name of the bridge? And the House has introduced a bill, I think they had a hearing on it not too long ago, that would simply add the word memorial to the name.
I think the name is a bit of a distraction from the larger issues out there. Right now, I believe it's March 13th is the end of the continuing resolution at the federal government. And so even though there was a bill passed in the last Congress to provide both the funding and the actual cash dollars, if there's not a continuing resolution moved forward by the Republican majority in Congress, then all of that is subject to being cut. And so, I think we have to be very realistic that now that we have data and we see where things are headed, that an entire agency dedicated to global stability is shut down, and there are 2,000 workers from Maryland who are now being forced to come back very quickly to the United States, uproot their families, no longer provide the services that they are providing in countries across the world that rely on aid to prevent pandemics and viruses. Those folks have had to stop doing that work. They've stopped publishing data. They've stopped working on public health. And there are huge consequences for that. And so, and the Republican majority has not moved forward or come to a consensus a month away from how they're going to fund government beyond that. So everything's on the table, sadly. I will still feel confident that hopefully reason prevails and that folks who rely on, there are a number of states out there that rely on these same resources that Maryland does. And so, I hope my colleagues in other states will feel this similarly. If anyone wants to add anything.
Given so much that is still happening of a major impact on the budget, you just said today, a couple of minutes ago, hundreds of millions of dollars of impact, we're a third of the way through the session. Are we gonna need a special session in order to deal with things that are still to come?
I certainly hope we don't need a special session, but things have been so uncertain that nothing can be ruled off the agenda. As you look at what data we'll have before the end of tax season versus what will come this summer, if there is another tax plan that is moved forward over the summer session in Congress that has another couple $100 million worth of impact in Maryland, we're going to have to address it, and we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to try and put forward as many protections as we can with the data and knowledge that we have. I do think we'll get some good information from what happens with the continuing resolution, how this new Congress and administration will approach these budget deficits. But at this point, given how dramatic the cuts have been and how intense they are for the state of Maryland, nothing's off the table.
Madam President, do you think that the state could look at changing eligibility requirements for Medicaid if the cost share does change?
I think we're going to have to look at Medicaid from top to bottom if there are cost splits. We can only do as much as we can fund. And so if we see a significant change in cost splits, we're going to have to look at eligibility, and we're going to have to look at ways to maybe enhance the healthcare access fund and make sure that we are trying to provide as much private access as may be available. I hope we don't get to that point, but of course, if we lose another $500 million, $1 billion because of cuts that are being shifted down to the state, every program has to be reevaluated even further.
Given the concern about Medicaid funding and maybe changes, there's been a change in leadership coming at the health department now. Is that an additional concern? Does that make it even more challenging given the uncertainty?
Look, we would look forward to meeting with the new health secretary that's been named. Certainly, we want to have conversations with that person before confirmation hearings. I think there have been some major issues in the financing through the health department that have created some deep concern for us. I've appreciated working with the secretary on a number of specific issues, but I will say on the financing side, we've had some major problems, and through Medicaid projections and through issues with DDA and projections with DDA, we're going to have some serious financial cleanup that happens. We need to get as certain as possible with dollars coming out of the health department.
How much can the state absorb in federal actions before you think it gets to the point where Maryland has to start touching some of the things that you've said that you don't want to touch, like Medicaid and moving patients back off of Medicaid, or some of the other things that we sort of consider, that legislators consider their core values. How much can Maryland absorb before we have to start looking at cutting those?
Not much more than where we are currently. And I would say even at this point, we're looking through each of these programs and making sure that we are getting the highest and best value that we can, because it's going to get tighter and tighter.
I have a question for Chair Feldman. We've exhausted this topic.
Sure.
On the energy package that was unveiled this week, there's contemplation of coming up with new generation in Maryland.
Right.
Is this something that you and other leaders have spoken with industry about? Is there real interest in that sector in coming up with new energy?
I would say the answer is yes. I mean, we wouldn't have put it in there just without having those conversations. I mean, look, I think the bottom line, one of the big problems, Senate President just talked about the cost of transmission line. One of the big issues is we import a tremendous amount of energy into the state. 40% of the power in the state we have to get from elsewhere. And one way you got to get there from Pennsylvania or anywhere else to the state of Maryland is through transmission lines. And so it builds on the cost. So the in-state generation issue is one of the things that we need to, I think, emphasize this session, and the package that we rolled out this week attempts to do that. So yes, now there's different issues there about who will do the generation and that kind of thing, and we're going to work through those issues. I want to emphasize also that when you saw that with the press conference, and I think I made this statement on Monday, a lot of close coordination between the House and Senate. When we actually do that package of bills for a bill hearing, we're going to do it together in a joint hearing, and I think that is a message that's important. So there's a lot more coordination, I think, this session than in the past. But yes, I think You know, I'll just make this point. The energy sector, I think, has hired almost every government relations person in Annapolis to weigh in on these issues. Yes, industry has been heard loud and clear, and I would say different component parts of it. You can't just lump industry into one fell swoop. So yes, the answer to that is absolutely yes, and in-state generation is part of the answer moving forward.
Can you share any information about what companies might be looking at in-state generation and where?
Well, I think the bills go to sort of different parts of the equation. We've got a study in the language, I think, in the bill that I've put in with C.T. Wilson, that will study the possibility of even our incumbent utilities getting back into the space. We've got the existing folks, like Calvert Cliffs is a nuclear power facility that generates 40% of the power in our state. With some retrofitting, we're told, of those existing 2 reactors, we could generate something like 180 new megawatts of energy, of nuclear energy. And so I think it's looking at what is in place right now, whether it's upgrades and that type of thing, looking at things that maybe we didn't look at after 1999. I think all things are on deck to get to the point, along with the idea of in-state generation, some of the regulatory hurdles that we have. We do not have a good reputation in terms of siting and permitting, and then one of the bills specifically tries to help on that front. We need out-of-state developers to come in and be willing to site projects here, and I think that they're going to be much more willing to do that if some of the provisions of particularly the siting bill, which is the bill that I introduced with Chair Wilson, and that's, I think, the goal of those bills.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Charles, the squatting issue seems to be a little bit under the radar for a lot of people. Do you have any stats to see to show us how widespread or how serious the problem is?
There are no stats that I have readily available right now, but I can get back with you on that. But it's been a major issue just from random people calling my office or different senators within Prince George's County. I know it's an issue in Baltimore City. And we have Republicans and Democrats alike putting in bills because it's impacting a lot of our communities across the state.
And the process in which it works, I mean, a criminal will simply take over someone else's home or address?
Literally, somebody can, you go on vacation and you come back home, somebody's in your house and you're trying to get them out, but they produce a fake lease. Or it could be a lease that comes from someone that fraudulently created a lease and gave it to someone else and rented your house out. And so there's no real way to get these people out of your house when you have those type of provisions in place. So creating this registry is going to be very important because it allows for the sheriffs, who are the ones who are responsible for getting these people out of the houses, to have something, somewhat of a rebuttable presumption on hand that allows for them to see these people are not supposed to be in this particular house. So once we get some stats, I'll be happy to share that with you, though.
Well, we're going to be taking a break next week. Brian apparently has a surprise for his wife for Valentine's Day, so he's asked that we not meet next week. Hope I haven't ruined the surprise. No, in all seriousness, we're going to take the 14th off, and we will be back on the 21st. But we will see you all throughout the week, and hope you have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.